Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest installment of our ongoing editorial webinar series, Coffee Talk. Each hour-long information-packed episode features the observations and insights of an independent expert on a wide range of tech industry topics. Many thanks to the underwriting sponsor of this episode, Mission Cloud Services, an industry-leading provider of Agile Cloud managed services and consulting. Without their support, this series would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator. Today's topic is AWS Cloud Cost Management, and our lead presenter is Cloud Security Architect Steven Smiley. But before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. This episode is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. We'll make some time during the talk for some questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see some extra resources provided by our sponsor. Be sure to check those out. And as a small thank you to the first 250 attendees who stick with us to the end, we'll be sending you a $5 gift certificate to Starbucks. It's a cup of joe to go with the info. Now, let's meet our first presenter. Steven Smiley is a consulting director at ScaleSec, where he leads cloud security advisory and engineering efforts. A former military intelligence officer, he balances strategic tactical thinking to help his company's customers accomplish their goals. Take it away, Steven.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me today. This is an exciting topic to talk about, cloud cost management, right? As John said, I work at ScaleSec, and we focus on cloud security. But one of the things that I've learned is that, in the cloud, all your different system characteristics are really tied together, right? So we do a lot of work with security, but security ties in with your architecture, which ties in with your cost, right? And your reliability and, all the other system characteristics that you're trying to have. Even though I, at ScaleSec, focus on security, one of the things I've learned is that we have to kind of consider all of these different pillars and see how they balance each other out. And that's actually the first thing that I'd like to say up front about cost management, right? Is that it has to be balanced with your other goals. And I find that it's not always at odds with your other goals, right? So, when you're looking at your performance efficiency and reliability, you're going to be thinking about scaling and horizontal scaling to make sure that things can fail over successfully. But that also helps you scale up and down to meet your demand and, minimize costs when you don't need to be spending that money, right? So that's one of the things that I've learned about cost optimization in the cloud. The other thing is that, when cost and security align, you can limit your risk exposure by just removing unnecessary stuff, right? Don't pay for it and don't provide risk to an attack surface to some attacker. Cost is just one pillar of your architecture. When there are trade-offs, right? When these things are at odds with each other, I would urge you to consider the trade-offs, right? And consider the cost of people's time, right? And not just the cost of the resources. Because at its core, cloud intends to enable us to have agility and speed with delivering our workloads, right? And maintaining them in a lower effort way. And so you want to consider those trade-offs and not just always try to minimize cost or always try to maximize performance, right? So that's the main context in which I think about cloud cost management. My goal today is to give you the broader perspective on what I see as the keys to successful cloud financial management. And notice that now I'm not just saying cost optimization, but rather the broader perspective of how do I manage my costs and my finances in the cloud? And so to me, there's four aspects to it. There's the governance, where you're planning and measuring your spend. There is the platform, right, where you're structuring your account, tagging your resources, and getting everything ready so that you can do that successfully. There's some operations aspect where you're continuously monitoring and optimizing. And then there's actually down at the architecture where you're optimizing your workload. Now, most people, when they think about cost optimization, are really just focused on that bottom level, right? They're thinking about the architecture and how do I, optimize my workload. But I will argue that if you want, as an organization, to be successful, you really want to think about these other keys, these other pillars, and put it all together. And so that's how I've organized my content here today. So the first thing I said was governance. And in the governance pillar here, we want to plan and measure our spend. Because we can't optimize something if we don't even know what it is and where is it coming from and, what are our trends, right? So the first thing is, as an organization, we need to establish some sort of cost optimization function. And that function should be identifying your cost attribution categories, right? Thinking about where the money is going and how we would put those together in a way that's helpful for us. And then based on those categories, we're going to make some budgets and try to do some forecasting so that we can overall plan and measure our spend. So getting into this a little bit more, what does it look like to have an effective cost optimization function? Well, what I mean by that is it's a partnership, right? Your technology teams, your finance teams, and management are all working together to try to manage your spend. And the team size and the effort here really is going to vary by your organization. This might be as small as just 2 people that you've given this responsibility to. They check in on it, once a week, and once they've got it going, they are not doing it all the time. In a larger organization, this could be people's full-time job, thinking about cost, and that can absolutely be worth it, right? If you've got spend in the order of a couple million a month, a couple people working on it all the time could absolutely be worth it. So when we're doing this, the challenge we have is that we want to balance our big picture with the local context, because you can't have people full-time looking at cost, but they have no idea what the architecture is and what those workloads are supposed to be doing, right? But you also can't focus too much on just the architecture people when they have no idea why are we spending this money and what is it worth, right? So it needs to be balanced. I'm showing on the screen here a diagram from the FinOps Foundation where they're showing, a central team with inputs from, engineering and business, finance, and how they all fit together. One of the things that your centralized team is going to want to focus on is governing and controlling commitments, right? In the cloud, one of the biggest levers you have with cost is commitments. So in AWS, that refers to like reserved instances or savings plans, but also things like your rates with cloud providers. At a big enough spend, you can get discounted rates that don't match the public rates, and so those your finance team are going to want to be the people that are negotiating those rates. And that central team is also allocating costs to specific teams or projects, services, however your organization is organized, and then they're going to be monitoring those budgets and identifying trends, and maybe going down to the team and saying, hey, what happened here? Your costs doubled. Is that what you were expecting? What changed? And maybe that is what they were expecting, maybe not, but that conversation is helpful. But an important part of this function is that ultimately the teams at the project and service level should be responsible for their own costs. They should know what they're spending, and they should be considering it in their trade-off. They should not always be saying, I want the biggest, beefiest compute instance because it will make my life easier. They should be considering those trade-offs. And ultimately, those decisions should be driven by, their business value and the total cost of ownership, right? So taking into consideration how much time does this save my people or cost them if I choose a cheaper option. So this is ultimately a partnership between finance and technology, and finance is really going to want to have input on savings plans, private pricing agreements, right? Once you start spending a little bit over $1 million a year, your cloud provider is going to be willing to sit down with you and talk about how can we give you a special discount program so that you stay with us. And that's going to be finance's job to negotiate. One of the other things that you're going to want to be thinking about, and this is where it really gets into security, is that your finance people should be able to directly access the costs in your cloud, right? So in AWS, we've got Cost Explorer, and they should be able to see that directly. They shouldn't have to wait until a bill arrives in, email. They should be able to slice and dice that data right there in Cost Explorer. And your developers should be able to do that too. Developers should be able to see what their costs are. But of course, finance should only be able to access costs. They shouldn't be able to, go pull data out of S3, right? They shouldn't be able to really read anything else. That's not their job. So that's going to be part of your least privilege consideration as you establish your identity and access management. But ultimately, giving people access to their information necessary is important so that everybody's working with the same information. One of the first things that your governance team is going to want to do is identify some cost attribution categories, right? Mapping costs to their business units and aggregating costs where it makes sense. So in AWS, there's a feature called cost categories. I've got a screenshot here on the slides showing how simple it really can be to create some cost categories with the various rules. Those can go across multiple accounts. Those can consider tags. Those can, consider a variety of, dimensions. And then you end up with, a clean way of saying, these are the costs for this project, for example. So that's a very powerful capability that AWS provides natively. It doesn't require any additional tools. And then once you've done that, you really want to make these accessible, and you want people to be looking at them because cloud cost overruns can happen really fast, right? One of the things that can happen, for example, is you've got a Lambda function that pulls data out of S3, or that is triggered by an object being put in S3, and then the Lambda function puts an object in an S3 bucket. Well, if that creates an infinite loop, right, and it continues to trigger itself, you could spend $10,000 in a day, right? So you need to have these cost categories, and you need to have some alerts and budgeting considered so that you can get that quickly. So conveniently, AWS provides capabilities for this. And this is one of the things that's often not used or just not set up by people in their organizations because, it's not the first thing they're thinking about. They're thinking about setting up their workloads. But I urge you to go in and set up some AWS budgets and configure budget reports. You can get a recurring report that'll go to your finance team or go to a manager, whoever wants to know how much is being spent on a particular period. And then you can set up alerts that will say, alert me when I am exceeding some particular forecast. That way, if on a couple days into the month you have a large cost overrun, you'll get a notification at that time and not at the end of the month when you have spent too much. So AWS budgets provide these capabilities with alerts, and I encourage you to go and set those up just right there in AWS. No special tools required. One of the newer capabilities that AWS is providing is cost anomaly detection, which will also help with this. So if you go in and set this up, you can get notifications where it'll say, maybe your overall spend hasn't changed drastically, but some particular service has changed. And it'll give you a notification that says, hey, something's going on with your Elastic Block Store usage. It's changed. And that's a good capability to have. So I encourage you to go and configure some AWS cost anomaly detections and set the alerts to go to the teams of people who will understand what that means, right? They will understand why their EBS volumes are different than they were last week. So that's governance at a high level. But one of the things that you'll notice is that when you're setting up your cost categories in your budget, it's going to have to be along particular lines of accounts and tags. And if you don't have those in place, it's going to be difficult to create effective categories. So one of the things you want to think about at the platform level is how are you structuring your account? How are you tagging resources? Are you doing that consistently? And then how can I implement some cost controls to prevent things from happening and not just wait until I am detecting them later with budget? So structuring accounts, this is another area where it very much intersects with security and operations considerations. You use AWS organizations to do this. You want to create accounts for different workloads and keep them relatively isolated, and then organize them into organizational units where policies can be applied to that unit or to a particular account. But you can do this in a hierarchical manner. And this is something you really want to plan for before you get too deep into AWS, because it's very difficult to move things later between these different accounts. So you want to make that plan. And then within those accounts, you can apply resource tags to the resources that you really want to know more about. And one of the best ways to do this is by using a tag policy, because then you can detect non-compliant resources. So here on the screen on the right, I've got what it looks like to use the tag policy or the tag editor, where you can search for resources that are not compliant with the tag policy. And then actually from right there, you can easily apply those tags if they are missing. So some convenient tags are things like environment, right? It's helpful to know how much does my production environment cost versus development or other non-production environments. And it's also really helpful to know that you're not spending too much on sandbox environments, right, where people spin up a bunch of resources and then forget about them. So that's very helpful. And one of the things that I think you'll find is that infrastructure as code is going to be pretty much essential for your tags to be applied consistently, because otherwise, if people can just go into the console and launch instances without applying tags, it's going to be really hard to catch up with all those tags. So just yet another reason that you should be using infrastructure as code for all your significant resources. Talking about cost controls, one of the things I do recommend you do is consider what things you might want to block so that you don't end up with surprise bills for just things that your organization doesn't need, right? One of those things is probably going to be regions. You probably only want to use a couple regions that are applicable to your business. It's rare that people really want to use more than 4 or 5 regions. And so, block them so you don't have to worry about costs coming from, a region that you're not using. And then also, I do recommend that you block the services that you're not expecting to use that are particularly sensitive. So I have a few here on the screen. SageMaker can be powerful, but also very expensive. I would say probably block people from using SageMaker unless they come up with a reason that they're going to use it. Recognition is another kind of AI-powered service, and these can get really expensive. There's also rare instance types, IX, 5A, things like this that you're probably not going to use unless you really have a reason. And so just block those so you can't accidentally spend way too much money. And then also we talked about commitments. You really don't want developers being able to purchase commitments on their own, at least not without prior approval. And there's a bunch of IAM actions that I tend to deny with a service control policy. So things like purchase reserved instances or create savings plans, but also for like Redshift, there's like purchase a reserved node offering. So I have these on the screen here, and I would say that I block these unless someone has a reason to go and purchase those, and then you can go and list the policy, create the purchase, and then reapply the policy. And that really helps limit some cost risk there. Okay, so we've talked about governance and some platform considerations. Let's now think about the operations, right? How do I continuously monitor and optimize my costs in AWS? So overall, you want to create some sort of workload review process, and that will, by continuously looking at your process or looking at your workloads, that will help you foster a cost-aware culture, right? Where your teams are thinking about costs, they know what they're spending, and they know how to manage them themselves. And then you're going to want to have that central team monitor cost proactively. So let's look at what that really looks like. Overall, you want to have some sort of process where you're making sure that you're looking at workloads on an appropriate frequency. You can decide the frequency, right? Like that might be every 18 months, right? Because this is something that you don't touch very much. It's not changing. It's not a big deal. And then there might be another workload where you're saying, we really want to go look at our web servers every 6 months, for example. And we're going to look at our database every year, something like that. So you want to think about, what is the appropriate frequency for this? How much is this changing? And, how much potential savings could there be? If there's a lot of potential savings, maybe look at it more frequently. And then I do recommend keeping some sort of log of reviews so that you can say, hey, look at all the savings that we found. Did we actually go and realize those savings, right? Like, did we connect with the workload teams and make sure that we actually captured those savings, or not? And then, maybe share those, right? Share those with other teams and say, look at the success that we're having finding issues, or even look at the success we're having in building cost-optimized workloads early on, and we're verifying that that's working because we know that we're looking at this thoroughly. So keeping some sort of log will help you keep that process going. And then I think with those reviews, you can align those with broader, well-architected reviews, right? So most organizations should be doing some sort of well-architected review of security or operations, every so often. And so you can incorporate the cost analysis into those, but I would just want to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten because it is an important pillar. So in doing so, one of the effects that you should have is that fosters a cost-aware culture. You're sharing success stories, you're sharing cost savings that you found, and then other teams can mirror that behavior. You can even share mistakes that you made so that other people don't make those same mistakes. And that's part of a mature culture where people can feel, safe and secure that if they do make a mistake, the lesson is learned rather than they're fired and then nobody actually learned the lesson, and so they're going to make the same mistake again later. One of the ways that I monitor costs proactively is by setting up cost anomaly detection, budget reports, and alerts. And I like to send those to Slack so that my teams can see what's going on in their costs right there where they're working. In fact, I don't even send these to a separate channel. Like, I don't like setting up a channel that's like cost alerts, because then everybody just mutes that channel. Nobody wants to see it. I like to send it right there into the channel about that workload. The challenge, of course, is that you need to tune it for a high signal to noise ratio, right? This cannot be firing off multiple times a day. This needs to be something that fires off, once a week or every 2 weeks when there's actually something to look into. And so that is a iterative process that you're going to need to figure out. And that is part of continuous optimization here. Okay. So before I go on to architecture, I wanted to see there's a few questions here. One question I see is how about using AWS config as part of cost control? And AWS config absolutely can be part of cost control. So you can create rules that look for expensive resources, and you can, if you want, you can automatically remediate those, right, by blocking them. But I don't think config would be my go-to, because there was probably a reason somebody created that, and so config can help you detect the issue, but I wouldn't spend too much time blocking that with config. And then, is this optimal for fresh business or not as affordable? So my answer to that is that if you're setting up a new AWS environment, I would love for you to consider these principles as you're starting out. So a fresh business would definitely want to consider all these things early on. But there's no reason that an existing business can't learn from this and try to do things better. It may be difficult to move existing workloads, to separate accounts, or totally refactor everything. But you can still apply tags and figure stuff out. And in the cloud, everything's always evolving, and so I think this is just part of your evolving process. Okay, so getting back to it, architecture, right? This is the real meat of cost optimization, right? Everything else was really just so that we can do this effectively. And I want us to remember that optimize does not always mean reduce, right? So we have to consider the context of the workload. And that's one of the reasons that I think that service teams need to be the primary people optimizing their own workloads. This cannot be something where an external team comes in just to criticize how they built something. Like, there were trade-offs made. So some of the primary pitfalls that we're going to look at for poorly optimized architectures are things like unnecessary resources, right? Or they're forgotten. And when we find those, we just know that we want to review them. Maybe communicate with people who would know about them, but ultimately remove them. The other pitfall is things that are just too big or inflexible, right? So compute instances that are just over provisioned, or a compute instance that's not set up to do any form of scaling. So sometimes we need that maximum capability, and most of the time we don't. When we find that, we want to do our best to make it the right size, and we want to set things up for auto scaling. And then the other pitfall is things that are just inefficient. And in the cloud, this is possible. It is possible to have things connect in a way that is just not efficient for cost. And in those cases, we will want to look at re-architecting that to use more cloud native capabilities. But in order to figure out what it is and what the right response is, we need to start analyzing costs, and I do that by workload, right? Rather than do it by all EC2 instances across all of my accounts, I want to do it by the specific workload, because I want to understand the context of that. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, AWS provides us the tools that we need. There are other tools available. There's third-party things that you can use, but AWS really provides us all the tools that we need for this. my go-to approach here is by saying what regions are in use, right? So going to Cost Explorer, saying group by region. And then I'm going to take a look at what services are in use by region, right? So I can filter it by region and then group it by service. And then looking at each of those services, especially the ones that we're spending a lot of money on, what can we do better, right? What can we adopt practice-wise, or is there an alternative AWS service that we can use that is going to balance our people's time and cloud costs better? Okay, so let's look at some of the most common services and maybe some of my tips for analyzing and fixing these. One of them is looking at EC2. This is the big one that everybody is always going to focus on. How much are we taking advantage of something like spot instances? To me, this is not immediately obvious in Cost Explorer. In order to see spot instance usage, you need to filter by the usage type and look at box, which refers to on demand or not spot usage. And then there's also spot. And then you can group it by the purchase option. So to me, that is not immediately obvious. But if you do that, you can get a sense of like, are we ever using spot instances or how much? And then another useful filter is by looking at, what instance types are in use. So filtering by EC2 instances and grouping by the instance type. One of the reasons this is really helpful is that this can help you figure out reserved instances and savings plans that are appropriate for you, because reserved instances generally are going to be for a specific instance type in a specific region. So if you are using a lot of the same type, then that can be very useful. If not, a savings plan is more flexible because that can cover multiple instance types. So that's one of the things you're going to want to look at. And then one of the lesser known things to think about is burstable instances. So burstable instances can be really nice because a lot of times they can be using less resources, and then when they get a quick demand, they can burst up and dynamically increase their resources. The problem, however, is that if you consistently are bursting beyond your baseline, you actually are incurring additional costs because you are exceeding the CPU credits that comes with that instance. And so it can actually be cheaper to just use a bigger instance than to consistently be bursting beyond the baseline. So, filtering by EC2 other and then usage type with CPU credits will help you determine how often is that happening. Okay, so then let's also talk about using EC2 in a more dynamic way. One of those things is there is instance scheduler available, which can help you start and stop instances based on a schedule. This is super helpful, especially for non-production environments, right? If you're not running integration tests throughout the night, go ahead and turn things off. I also think that the EC2 Compute Optimizer, or AWS's Compute Optimizer, has gotten a lot better over the last couple of years. It used to be not very helpful, and now it really is helpful, not just for size, but it can also recommend a different instance family for you, which is not the most obvious thing, right? So I got on the screen here an example where you've got an M4 large, and they're recommending a T3 large. These are very different families, and Compute Optimizer is pretty good at figuring out what the appropriate family is based on its observed usage. I also think you should look at the new price capacity optimized allocation strategy for spot instances, which I think was just recently released, and that should really be your new default. It does a better job of making sure that you're meeting your required demand but in an optimized way. So there's a lot of different things to consider here. I also think that you should be looking at EC2 other costs. That's one of the big ones. Interzone data transfer, right, where you've got EC2 instance in one zone and a database in the other, and they are talking across each other. If you can put them in the same zone, then you're not going to be paying for that interzone transfer. So there's a number of things there. AWS Lambda, for the most part, Lambda is one of the cheaper services that people have in use. But if you do make heavy use of it, then you do want to really consider its cost optimization. And there's a really awesome tool called Lambda Power Tuning that I'm constantly trying to get people to use more, and they're not very aware of, because it will produce this really helpful graph we see here on the right that it will run the Lambda function with a variety of configurations and show you the graph of like how was I able to reduce the invocation time by giving it more memory, and how did that change the cost? So finding this crossover point will help you find an optimal configuration. And it also considers the ARM-based Graviton 2 underlying instance type that can reduce cost and improve performance just by adopting the ARM-based configuration. So let's see. I'm happy to talk about any of these other tips if you want, but I won't read everything to you. I also think you can look at things like ECS. The EC2 launch type has no additional charge, but if you do make use of Fargate, it charges a premium, and I don't think everybody realizes that. It can definitely save operational time here, but if you're using like a T3 large instance, Fargate charges like a 40% premium, so that can be pretty significant if you use ECS at scale. And Fargate Spot does exist and can have a significant discount of up to 70%. And as I'm showing on the screen here, you can create a cluster that puts a higher weight on Fargate Spot than regular Fargate, so that you can always be trying to get Spot, but if not, you'll still meet your capacity. EKS is another common one, and this is one that actually provides a significant challenge, because Kubernetes clusters tend to include many workloads within them, and AWS does not have a great way of breaking that out for you. Then that's just the nature of Kubernetes. But there's two recommendations I have here. One is to consider the Carpenter autoscaler in place of the standard Kubernetes cluster autoscaler. AWS actually produces this as an open source tool, and it can be a lot better for rapid autoscaling that also optimizes cost. And then there's a tool that is available as a CNCF sandbox project called KubeCost that can help you provide cost allocation from within your Kubernetes cluster by namespace or label or however you're setting it up. And so if you do make heavy use of Kubernetes and you want to look at costs within that cluster, that would be my way to go. Let's see. RDS. One of my top recommendations is to adopt AWS Graviton. It takes virtually no effort these days and can reduce costs significantly. And unfortunately, RDS is not covered by savings plans, but you can still get reserved instances specifically for them. VPC, this tends to not be one of the biggest issues. NAT gateways can be an issue if you're leaving them unused, and recent changes to the AWS pricing model have given you a lot more free data transfer. So CloudFront is now able to go up to a terabyte for free, and regional data transfers up to 100 gigabytes. So unless you're above those limits, I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about optimizing those data transfer costs. And then The last one that I'll recommend here is take a look at your S3 costs. Use S3 storage lens to do a little bit of analysis and figure out what storage classes am I using? Can I use something other than standard to save some money? And if you don't know, just use intelligent tiering. It's actually very effective at down tiering your costs, but retaining the ability to retrieve them whenever you want. And then, of course, use lifecycle policies to delete data so you're not paying for it when you don't need it anymore. So I know that was pretty quick. I'm happy to answer any additional questions about architecture in detail if you'd like. But in summary, we've got governance, platform, operations, and architecture. If you set these 4 things up in your organization, you really can have successful cloud financial management. And I'd love to answer any of your questions about how to do this effectively. And I'd also like to invite anybody to connect with me on LinkedIn to talk more about it if you'd like after this webinar. Again, I'm Steven Smiley at ScaleSec. So, John, that's what I've got for you.
Yeah.
Let's go into questions.
Yes, sir. Looks like we've got a couple questions here. Let's see. Let's start with this one. Steven, if I'm building a new application in AWS, how can I start off with a cost-optimized architecture?
That's a good question, John. This is one I get a lot because, people maybe get a little afraid of cloud costs, right? And they don't want to adopt a bunch of cloud services and then get a big bill, right? So I recommend building a new workload with event-driven architecture as much as possible. AWS has built core serverless components for this. This is what they use internally, even to build their own services. So those things are, Lambda, DynamoDB, API Gateway, S3. Those are their core things, and you can build so much with just that. These services will really involve the lowest cost, both low cloud costs and operational costs, right? With a managed database like DynamoDB, you don't need a database person all the time, monitoring it and tuning it. You do need to know about DynamoDB and use it correctly, but you can learn that for a lot less than you can, manage a whole fleet of databases. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, here's one. What third-party tools do you recommend for cost management? That's a pretty straightforward question.
Yeah, so, the first thing I will say is that AWS has greatly improved the tooling that they make natively available. So my recommendation is to make full use of what AWS provides before looking to third-party tools. However, there are things out there, right? It's very common that people will use Cloud Health from VMware, or any number of other things, especially if they are looking for costs across multiple organizations, multiple clouds, and that's just how they want to approach it. And then one complaint I will have, however, with tools like that is that I don't like going to a separate dashboard to look at the cost, especially if those dashboards are slow to update or if the numbers don't match what I'm seeing directly from AWS. So I generally like to look at the ground truth. There are some open source tools that can help you analyze cost. For example, SteamPipe is a tool that I use occasionally, and they have a Thrifty mod for AWS that will go and try to find cost savings opportunities for you. So that's something that you might want to look at if you want to, look for kind of quick wins. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, we got time for one more. This one from Wahid, who's wondering, are AWS native cost management tools multi-cloud aware?
No. I mean, the short answer is no, right? That's just not what they're designed to do, right? AWS will tell you your cost. It will help you slice and dice your AWS costs, but there's no way to pull, for example, Azure costs into AWS and use Cost Explorer. Whereas I believe Azure has some capability to pull in your AWS information and look at it using their tools, if that's something that you are interested in. But personally, if I was managing multiple clouds, I would just look at each one in their tooling. And I think that would be the way to go.